We already looked at resampled instruments when we took a look at the sampler and loaded up a sound font file, but there also are separate plugins that exist that are multi-sampled instruments. And with these instruments, it's really about the quality of the recording and how that instrument was resampled. So don't let a really fancy interface fool you. That happens all the time with people who I talk to, and they're like looking at different pianos they want to maybe buy, and they really get fooled sometimes by the interface. And a lot of times they go, "Oh, I really love this piano," and you look at it and you listen to it, and it doesn't always match up, especially when there's a specific reason that they're using that piano. So do keep that in mind when you are looking at resampled instruments. And in our example here, we're just going to look at a couple because they happen to be instruments that for me, I like the sound of, and or I think when we move into next week in processing, you're going to be able to process them a lot further. So this is totally different from all of the other instruments we've looked at before. These are all just sample players. All they're doing is playing back audio files, and you can't really do a whole lot else with them, but that's okay because if the tone of the instrument is right, then it's going to work. You'll have the option of adding in 3 additional instruments, and I've picked 3 out that I personally like. If you want to vary from that, if there's something you're really looking for, you can feel free to download that as well, but don't spend more than 5 or 6 minutes browsing through because at that point, you're going to start getting distracted. Anyway, this is a piano that is really large. It's like 1.55 gigabytes, and I actually really love the tone and the sound of this city piano. So you look at this and you kind of think, oh man, this is going to be like really amateur, right? Like it's just like this kind of corny picture of the New York skyline in the background, and we have just the piano. But actually the sound of it is really quite nice, at least for me. And what I love about this piano is that they've really spent a lot of time with the velocity layers. And so when you play really softly up to really loud, you really can't tell that there's been different samples taken at all of those different velocities. So for me, this is a piano that I actually go to sometimes over some really expensive paid ones that exist out there. So just an FYI, I really like this one. If you don't want to download it and you don't have any use for it, don't download it. But if you need a piano that sounds like this, I personally think it's a pretty good one. We also have the oboe here that we can take a look at. And with this oboe, you actually get 3 different options of samples. So a solo oboe, oboes in a sustained fashion, and then an English horn. And for whatever reason, I've downloaded a lot of these Sonatina instruments before, and the oboes sound really good to me. The other instruments, not as much. Maybe it's just because I like the sound of the oboe, but I think from a processing standpoint, when we move into that next week, you'll be able to do a lot if you do actually have an oboe part in there. And you do have an envelope that you can use if you want to shape it. So we could actually turn this more into like something that's unrealistic to how the oboe is played, but inside of the computer, that's totally fine. That's actually part of the point. So you do have this envelope here. You also have a volume control. We have oboes sustaining, of course, with some vibrato at the end, and then also an English horn. So and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, I actually do like the sound of these. And if you use your mod wheel, this is common on a lot of resampled instruments. You can take the vibrato and make it really kind of crazy. Oop. And you can even play these as chords, which obviously you can't do with an actual instrument. But again, you're in the computer. There really aren't any rules here. It's all about the sound, not really following any strict guidelines. Last but not least, we have the choir. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan on the sound of this choir in its original state, in its default state, but you can process this and make it sound pretty good. You can push it all over the place. You can add a bunch of versions of the instrument, like bounce out a lot of different sounds and process them all a little bit differently, and it can be somewhat convincing. So this is just the sound. So you have a ladies group and then you have a gentleman's. Unfortunately, it doesn't combine them together, so you'd have to use two different versions of the instrument if you want both. I got to go down an octave here. We'll go even further, I think. So the reason I actually like choir sounds normally is just to kind of throw in as a layer. If you're looking for realism, you're going to have to spend a ton of money, but usually you can kind of hide this and sneak it in the back. And as freeware, hey, there's nothing wrong with that, right? There's no better price. So these are just three examples. I would say you can pick whatever three you want, but again, don't spend more than 10 or 15 minutes. Once you make your decision, stick with it. And remember, never judge a book by its cover, especially with multi-sampled instruments, because it's about how the instrument's been recorded, not about how much time they've spent on the interface.